Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, how the minorities in the United States are living the first year of Donald Trump at the White House. Our guest, Angela Peoples, campaign director of ACRE, the Action Center on Race and the Economy. Angela, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Jorge. I'm glad to be here.
Tell me, what do you think that, Donald Trump is saying, we're making America great again? Is he making America great again for the minorities, for example, the African-American minority?
I would say definitely not. When Donald Trump says "Make America Great Again," during the campaign and the many months that took in 2016, that mantra "Make America Great Again," for many African American and Black people, we knew that was a code for make America back to when white folks or the white people were dominant and more people of color, Black people were in a less powerful position. And so whether that's from in the economically, politically, culturally, in our schools, in medicine, the idea of Donald Trump's vision and version of making America great again is America that is a place where people of color cannot thrive.
And recently, during his State of the Union address, he says, and I quote, "Something I'm very proud of, African American unemployment stands at the lowest rate ever recorded."
Well, I would say a couple of things to that. First, the unemployment rate is just one of many factors that determine how one community or one population is doing in this country, right? And so that's one that, like, the employment rate may reflect, the unemployment rate may be low, but that doesn't talk about wages, it doesn't talk about wage growth, it doesn't talk about access to wealth. Which are really important indicators for whether or not a particular community is doing well in the country. And the other thing that I would say is that there are many statistics and many reports that the unemployment rate for African Americans and the low unemployment rate across the board is more to do with policies that were put into place during the Obama administration, both in the beginning and even towards the end of the Obama administration, that actually led to increase in jobs and increase in job training programs that may be contributing to the lower unemployment
so
rate.
It's not his merits.
It's certainly not his merit. I cannot think of one thing that the Trump administration did in 2017 that would have had a direct impact on the employment rate of Black folks. But I can think of many things that he has done to make, to further criminalize and by criminalize I mean pass laws or policies or put into place standards that make it more likely for people to be arrested and then detained or put into jail for longer periods of time, which impacts your ability to work.
You have become a viral star the day after Trump's inauguration. We're talking about January 20th, 2017. That means that January 21st, you were at the Women's March here in Washington.
That's right. And
you were having with you basically a banner, or whatever you call it, a sign, and that read, "Don't forget, white women voted for Trump," and you mentioned 53% of them.
Yes.
Why it got such a impressive reaction?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons. So, as I said earlier, the Make America Great Again mantra was just code speak for make white people have more power or stop the growth of, the demographic shifts that are bringing more Hispanic and Latino folks into our country and are growing the population of Black people that have access to education and have access to wealth. So we saw that the election of Donald Trump, when a majority of white women voted for him, they voted for him not because he was some great businessman that was going to run the country in this efficient way. We've seen him now on shutdown number 2 that just happened, the government shutdown number 2 that recently just happened. He's not doing a very good job of running the country or being a very good politician. He is doing a very good job of amplifying and emboldening white racist people. And so I carried that sign to the Women's March, which was a space where mostly white women were coming together. It was close to, I believe, 500,000 just in Washington, D.C., and there were marches across the country. But it was a space where, again, it was a vast majority of white women. They came together, but for me, there was no conversation about the fact that even though all of these white women were coming to protest Trump and they were a part of the resistance, their friends, their neighbors, their cousins, their coworkers voted for a very obviously racist, sexist, homophobic, elitist man to be president. And this idea that these white women were then going to lead a massive resistance that unified the country against Donald Trump was extremely hypocritical and also dangerous. I think extremely dangerous to move forward with this idea that we can all resist together without having a conversation about what is at the root of how we got to this moment, which is a lot of racial animosity.
Did they come to you and say things?
Well, the response that I got was very interesting. So a lot of women, as I was carrying the sign, a lot of white women said, "Not me, not this white woman." And my response is, that's not the point. The point is I'm not assuming that all of the white women that came to the march secretly voted for Donald Trump. But what I am saying is, someone that if 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, that means someone in your family, someone at your job.
Someone in the crowd.
Someone in the crowd, likely, exactly, did in fact vote for Donald Trump. And the Donald Trump that we knew that was on the ballot was put out a very racist, anti-immigrant, anti-poor, it was very clear who he was when they voted for him. And so, when the women said, well, not this white woman, and why are you being divisive? My point is, I've been an organizer and activist for 10 years. Black women and women of color don't need white women to say, oh, we're so sorry and we're coming to work with you. We need them to be in their own communities talking to other white women about why this racial animosity showed up with them in the ballot box, why they chose to vote for Donald Trump instead of a fellow white woman who had the opportunity to be the first female president. Hillary Clinton certainly has many faults, and there are lots of reasons that a lot of people weren't supporting her. But talking specifically to white women, what was the thing that allowed them to pull the ballot, to check the box for Donald Trump, knowing that all of the things that he stood for, and not someone else that could have been moving their so-called women's rights forward?
And it was not enough with a sign. You also were wearing a hat.
Yes.
And
I love that hat.
They had read, quote, "Stop killing black people."
Yes.
Why?
So I've been, one of the things that grounds my work and my organizing is Black liberation. And by Black liberation, I mean building and creating a world where both policy shifts and cultural shifts happen in a way that can allow Black people, especially Black women and Black trans women, to live our lives in the way that we choose, and to live our lives freely. And one of the biggest, and not just biggest, but sort of most visible challenges to that is the way that police, especially in law enforcement, attack, brutalize, and often kill Black people, Black men, Black women, Black children. This happens in the case of Michael Brown, who was killed in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, where he was killed just on the street by a police officer.
Unarmed.
An unarmed Black man, yes, and a teenager.
Almost a teenager, exactly.
A teenager on his way to see his family members was just gunned down in the street off of the suspicion that he was a criminal without any warrant.
Because he was stealing cigarettes, supposedly.
According to the officer had a call that there was someone that might have fit his description, tall Black youth. There are many of those in Ferguson, Missouri. that they were looking for someone who had stolen cigarettes. And again, even if Michael Brown had committed that crime, death is not the penalty for stealing cigarettes, right? And so whether it's Michael Brown or Sandra Bland, a woman who was killed who died in jail, not just, well, she wasn't shot, but she died in jail, and we're not even sure how she died, but because she was pulled over for suspicion, again, of being a criminal. And so there's all of these stories of Black people who are just living their day-to-day lives and are being killed by the police, or by other law enforcement agencies.
At a rate that is different from whites?
At a rate that is much higher than whites. And in fact, you could even look at drug policies or drug enforcement, right? The usage of drugs, especially in suburban areas, is much higher among white people, especially white teens. But the laws that are enforced and the folks that are in jail or experience violence from the police, or who are stopped or pulled over, which leads to being shot or being beaten up or being put into jail and having the experience of being in the incarceration system. The rates are much higher amongst Black people than they are white people, although the rates of usage are much more balanced.
The idea that all the terrorist acts that happen in the U.S. are committed by white people, and on top of that, they are not being qualified like terrorist attacks. They're not terrorists. Terrorists are only people coming from the Middle East.
Right.
How you interpreted that?
I mean, I would call that another example of white supremacy, this idea that whiteness is normal, is the ideal, is the standard, and everything else is different from that. That's another example of how white supremacy and white dominance culture shows up in American policies. The idea that a man, for example, the shooter in Las Vegas at the end of last year, end of 2017, could amass hundreds of guns and kill 50 people in just the matter of about 10 minutes, and him not be investigated as some sort of terrorist attack, or some sort of even if he wasn't aligned with the broader white nationalist organizations, which we know we don't actually have proof that he was not aligned with those organizations. If he had been a Black person, or if he had been a person from the Middle East, there would have been immediate calls to tie him to any sort of number of terrorist groups. And this is all in order to maintain this idea that whiteness, white people are normal, and anything that might be considered a issue of mass concern that indicates that there is a problem within the white community is deemed as it's dismissed, it's separate, it's a lone wolf, something that we don't need to address, something that we don't need to pass mass policies around.
So a different standard.
A very much a different standard.
What happened, do you think, then in the first year of Trump and the White House with the Hispanic community?
Well, I think what we saw throughout that year is a lot of changes in immigration enforcement that really changed the dynamics of how the Hispanic community is able to live and breathe and exist in their country. There were different conversations about, and I think that this is tied to, but is not direct, is not quite the same. The first thing that we saw was the Muslim travel ban. Although that was a lot of folks did not necessarily say, oh, this is targeting the Hispanic community. It was a step in shifting immigration enforcement and how administrations set and determined who was allowed to come in and out of the country. I think that the Muslim ban led to the repeal of temporary protected status that we saw happen to the El Salvadorian community, to the Honduras community, and many other countries, folks from countries that had the temporary protected status over decades, going back far before the Obama administration. And so the repeal of temporary protected status, I think, was a bridge, another step forward to try to push people that have been in this country for decades and build their lives here and build in their communities, to push them out and to make the country, as Donald Trump would say, great again, but as we observe, as more white.
Precisely, talking about immigration. Donald Trump said that he favors a merit-based legal immigration reform. And on top of that, he has said that he prefers immigrants from Norway over shithole countries like ones in Africa and some in Latin America. Your reaction?
It's par for the course. This is Donald Trump telling us exactly what he believes. And there is a tendency in the U.S. media to say, well, he said that, but that's not what he means, or he's just joking, or he's just really brash. The very racist, very anti-immigrant things he says is exactly what he believes, and it's exactly what the people that are setting his policies believe. So we should take him at his word. I also think that his statement is an important one for Hispanic and Black communities to pay attention to, and to recognize that the issues that are that we may have thought divided us or kept us separate are actually very much aligned. There's a strong immigrant population of folks from African countries, from Caribbean countries, and people who may present as Black but are Afro-Latino, or and thinking about how that statement and the policies that will result from that statement. We basically want white, blonde hair, blue-eyed people coming into our countries, like from Norway. Although I suspect Norwegians are not interested in coming to the U.S.
Because they have free healthcare
exactly.
and other privileges.
Their standard of living is very different than ours.
Different meaning?
Better, definitely. And also, even if there were Norwegian immigrants that wanted to come to the country, that actually doesn't say anything. That has nothing to do with merit. Them being Norwegian has nothing to do with this merit-based system that Donald Trump says that he wants. And I think that it's important, as we're thinking about how these issues affect different communities, or how we might think they don't affect different communities, that we talk about the racist, anti-Black, people of color sentiment that is rooted in this idea that all of the countries in Africa are shithole countries.
And some in Latin America too.
And that countries in Latin America are or that people are immigrating from these countries because they are desperate for whatever the U.S. has, and also that even if they're immigrating for the country for whatever reason, that there is not a merit, or I would even say, instead of merit, I would say value and asset to our country.
In terms of what happened during the first year of Donald Trump at the White House with the LGBT community, what happened?
Well, what we saw with the LGBT community and we saw this also with Muslim communities and African American communities as well, not necessarily as a result of policy, but a result as the tone that the Trump White House has set, is a rise in hate crime, a rise in violence and
intolerance?
Intolerance and also attacks on people simply because they are gay or trans or bisexual. And attacks on people because they may wear a hijab or may have a last name that sounds like they're Muslim. Or attacks on people or protesters, right, that are standing up for the rights of Black people, being pushed out or being even run over, like we saw in Charleston, Charlottesville, Virginia, last summer in 2017. We see an uptick in violence that's perpetrated by white people, white nationalists, or people who want to build a white power nation in the U.S. And this is not necessarily because of a policy that's been set by the Trump administration, but because of the tone that Donald Trump and his appointees to different agencies have set. We've also seen, particularly in education, the Obama administration was very forward in protecting transgender students, both on college campuses and in elementary schools or kindergarten through high schools. And they had policies where they encourage schools to have gender-inclusive restrooms, or to have established counselors that could work with children who had different gender identities or presented differently, to allow for them to feel more comfortable and safe in school. And we've seen the Trump administration roll those back significantly, and in fact push for policies that actually make transgender students less safe on campus, or make them more of a target when it comes to bullying.
Talking about the economy, Donald Trump proposed a 10% increase in the military. We're talking about like $55 billion, at the expense of cuts in social programs such as healthcare, education, and explained that the military increase is necessary because the U.S. is being threatened by different threats. How you read that proposal that in bottom line creates more inequality and more disparity?
Well, I would say a couple of things. It does certainly create more inequality. These are policies that have been this is a trend, I should say, investing, like sucking money from social services or healthcare or education programs and putting into the military is a trend that we've seen over the past 10 years. It didn't just start with the Trump administration. They are now doubling down on that. But this started with the quote-unquote austerity measures that we saw put into place in 2010 and in 2012. But this also shows an investment in militarization and law enforcement. So even though we see when people hear investment in the military or more money for our troops, they might think that that's money that's going overseas to fight our wars. But actually, that money goes into large corporations that are building planes and building missiles and building body armor that is actually not needed in a situation when we're not in wartime.
The war industry.
Right, exactly. The broader military and war industry, this is where those resources are going, and those people are heavy funders of Donald Trump and other Republican politicians, and Democrats as well. But I think it's important when people hear we're sending money for our troops, or we're putting more money in our troops, that money is not going to health care for veterans or for troops. It's not going to mental health care, which is such a crisis in our veterans. It's going to companies and corporations and wealthy people who are trying to build more planes and more bullets and more armor in a time when we don't actually need it, in a scenario where war, to the extent that it would be necessary in our country, that's not what it looks like.
And Angela, for you, when you live here and you hear all over the place that the U.S. is going to war to protect freedom and liberty, do you believe it? Why do they really go to war? Because there are many wars going on at this very moment, and with Barack Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize, he started 5 wars. Mm-hmm. What is the truth?
I think the truth is that the war is connected to the economy. And our economy, the U.S. economy, and I think many other countries' economies are dependent on this war industry to be thriving, to be able to create jobs, or to build more wealth for investors. And so when you talk about going to war, part of it is we want to use these resources, right? We want to put more money in. And also, when you go into war to other countries, there's ways to manipulate their economy to be in favor of not the U.S. economy, but to be in favor of the private capital that is invested in spreading out or what you might call colonialism or imperialism into other countries, to be able to take those resources and put them into the banks in the U.S. and around the country.
Last couple of minutes, talking about wealth concentration.
Absolutely.
Bernie Sanders is saying that one tenth of 1% of the U.S. population has as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Worrisome for you?
Very worrisome. I think that this is a trend that will continue unless, and Donald Trump's election was a a surefire way to continue the expanding of that wealth gap, which is, again, it's why it's important to have a conversation about why so many white people voted for Donald Trump, because it was very clear that the people that he was going to hire to run the agencies, the policies that he was going to put in place were pro-corporate, pro-him, pro the top 1/10 of 1% of people who hold all of the wealth in this country, and I would even say in the world, and so but so many millions of Americans were fooled into fooled themselves into thinking that they were voting for a pro-white working class president, when actually they were voting for their sort of pro-white policies and completely ignoring the working class element of what they said was needed.
Finally, do you think that Donald Trump is going to end his term?
I certainly hope so. But I think that whether or not he leaves early, to me, I think is less important. What is important is what we are able to do as activists and organizers and as people to stand up and to say, this is not what we want as a country. This is not what our communities need. This is not what we need to thrive and to move forward into the next version of the United States. What we're seeing right now is the last grasp of a hold of a dying reality in the United States, where white people hold all the power, and people of color are the poor ones that do all the work. We are seeing the last grasps of that. And so whether or not Donald Trump holds his presidency for 4 years, what is important is that we as people come together, Black, Hispanic, and white folks who are actually trying to move beyond this old world in order to say, no, reject that old world, and to fight for and to build something new.
Angela Peoples, thanks very much for joining us.
Yes, thank you.